This podcast contains graphic content and may not be suitable for all listeners. Listener discretion is strongly advised.
True North True Crime is produced on the territories of the Coast Salish people.
I guess I just sort of want Jodi to be seen as a human face that any parent with a teenage daughter, I think could have happened to anybody. And I think that's the hard part of it all, right? I had a teenage daughter at the time. And also it sort of strikes home,
That Jodi was funny and loud and that you'd have a good time with her and that she probably would have achieved something amazing. I really believe that, like, in my heart, that she would be someone notable now and that she would be happy and that she'd probably have children and a great family. And I really, really hope that she would have lived in California and got to live the life that she deserved to live if someone hadn't decided to take it away from her.
It has now been 15 years since Jodi Henrickson went missing. Despite exhaustive searches and a robust investigation, Jodi has not been found. While some people have speculated that she left Bowen Island, the majority believe that her remains are still there. The official investigation into her disappearance has indeed gone cold. However, a team of documentary filmmakers have created new media attention and new lines of inquiry that may blow this case wide open. In this episode, we present part 2 of the disappearance of Jodi Henrickson, and you are listening to True North True Crime.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to part 2 of the disappearance of Jodi Henrickson. Thanks so much for joining us. If you have not yet listened to part 1, we suggest you go check that out first. Otherwise, you're going to have trouble following this episode. We put this episode together using publicly available news articles, as well as interviews with retired Sergeant Peter Cross and documentarian Jenni Baynham. As an additional content warning, this episode deals with violence against women, intimate partner violence, and there is a brief mention of child sexual abuse. We have a lot of ground to cover in this episode, so let's hop right into part 2.
So just to recap for those who have listened to part 1, Jodi Henrickson was a 17-year-old girl growing up in Squamish, British Columbia. On the weekend of June 19th, 2009, she lied to her parents, stating that she was going camping for a few days in Chilliwack, BC. Instead, she hopped on a ferry and traveled to a party where her on-again, off-again boyfriend Gavin would be. Only 2 weeks earlier, Gavin had entered into a probation agreement after admitting to assaulting Jodi in April of 2009. Part of that probation order was that Gavin was to have no direct or indirect contact with Jodi for the duration of the 18 months of probation that he received for his guilty plea. Gavin was on Bowen Island that weekend working for his father, and his job was to rip some insulation out of one of his dad's rental properties that was undergoing renovations. The house itself was razed from its foundation and there was no furniture inside. On the night of June 19th, Gavin got heavily intoxicated, and when Jodi arrived at the party, he was duct taped to a railing by his friends for attempting to drink and drive. Jodi left that party but returned later to retrieve a now slightly less intoxicated Gavin. The two were seen walking near the intersection of Miller Road and Scarborough Road, walking in the direction of the rental home, and this was around 6:30 in the morning. Gavin states that they got into some type of verbal argument and that he left Jodi on the side of the road and he did not look back. Unfortunately, no more witnesses have come forward to claim to have seen Jodi past that 7:30 mark. despite the amount of early morning traffic and tourism in the area. Taking a look at Gavin's movements after he left Jodi has raised some questions. We are once again joined by documentary filmmaker Jenni Baynham and former homicide investigator Peter Cross.
So the last witness sighting of Jodi was between 6:30 and 7:30 a.m. on the morning of June 20th, 2009. And shortly after this is when Gavin said that they got into some sort of heated disagreement. The witness was able to give a description of Gavin and Jodi, but did not notice if Jodi had a bag with her.
They didn't state that she had a bag, they stated what she was wearing and the general condition of the two people that were walking, which was visibly tired, slumped against each other, struggling, like, where they had walked to there, they'd been very slow, they'd obviously stopped and whatever, and there's some details, again, I can't go into, just now, but it's uphill, it's a long walk, and if I had been partying all night like they had, like, I'd be pissed. I'd be like, "Where the fuck are we going?"
When asked about the argument by journalist Neil Boyd for an article in Vancouver Magazine, Gavin is quoted as saying, "She probably said something. It was starting to heat up. She wanted me to go back to Doug's and get my dad's truck so that we could take off and go to Calgary." In this quote, Gavin opens up the idea that Jodi wanted to leave the province. So around 6:30 or 7 a.m., they have this fight, and Gavin allegedly leaves. He walks the maybe 10 to 15 minutes back to the rental house on Eagle Cliff, where he said he was going to take a nap and then rip out some insulation for his dad. This could potentially bring him to the house on Eagle Cliff Drive by 7:30 a.m.-ish. However, Gavin is then seen on the road again around 8 a.m., so that would have been a very quick nap for someone who was out partying all night. Here's Peter with more on the morning timeline of Gavin's movements.
Gavin himself, an hour later, around, or maybe, let's say, around 8:30, he is out and gets a ride by a woman where he's dropped off at where she worked, and then he walked the rest of the way to Harding Road and retrieved his truck and then went back to the rental house.
Again, according to Neil Boyd's article, around 8:30 a.m., a young woman from The Orchard, a substance abuse treatment center, picked up Gavin near the elementary school. She then dropped him off outside of the treatment center as she was going to work. Gavin said he walked from The Orchard to Doug Harding's house where the party was the night before, which was about a kilometer away from The Orchard, and got his father's truck. He spent about 30 minutes cleaning up after the party and gathering empty bottles, but didn't see anyone in the house, and no one saw him. He then states, quote, "Then I drove back to my dad's house and started removing insulation." This potentially puts him back at the rental home around 9:30 a.m. Gavin is not seen again until around 11 a.m. That day, there was a funeral service for a respected Bowen Island resident named George, and Bowen Islanders of all ages showed up to the Legion Hall to pay their respects. At just after 11 a.m., a friend remembers Gavin walking into the service late. He told Neil Boyd, quote, "I could hear the truck arrive outside, and he looked pretty messed up." Another witness recalls, "He was staring at the ground, he had his head in his hands, he looked very messed up." Now, the Legion Hall is about a 1-minute drive from the rental house where Gavin was supposed to be ripping out insulation. The questions now being asked are, why did Gavin go home for less than an hour, only to leave to go get his truck? Why did he need his truck when he was only pulling out insulation? Also, keep in mind the funeral was a quick walk from the rental home. What was Gavin doing between 9 a.m. when he left the Harding Road residence with his truck and 11 a.m. when he arrived at the funeral? And lastly, did he really leave Jodi on the road at the turnoff to Miller's Landing, or did Jodi return to the empty rental home with him? Gavin is then seen after the funeral at a local pub where he ordered some potato skins. He stated in the article that, quote, "I ordered some potato skins, but I couldn't eat them because my jaw was still sore from Doug hitting me. I went to the pharmacy and got a protein shake." According to Neil Boyd, another friend recalled seeing Gavin at the pub in the early afternoon and stated he looked fucked up. That night, Gavin did not sleep at the rental house. Instead, he slept at Doug Harding's house on Miller Road, where the party took place the night before. Then, on Sunday, the following day, he went back to Squamish to stay at his mom's house. This would be Sunday, June 21st. Jodi has now been missing for over 24 hours, and no one has been made aware yet. According to Peter, this is the timeline that has remained intact for the last 15 years.
So that's sort of the chronology of Jodi and her disappearance. And that virtually hasn't changed, I don't think, since the day 15 years ago. And even after, reviewing and going over and re-interviewing people, that really hasn't changed in any way, shape, or form. We have not uncovered any other sightings of her or anything like that.
Jodi's parents expected her home on Tuesday, June 23rd, but she did not come home. She had not contacted any of her friends or family members, nor has she posted on her social media. The next day, Wednesday, June 24th, Bo and Nancy Henrickson made their way to the Squamish RCMP detachment, where they filed a missing person report for their 17-year-old daughter. At this time, they did not know that no one had seen their daughter alive since the morning of June 20th. Peter recalls getting the call that there was a missing teen on Bowen Island and explained how he became involved in this investigation.
I was in charge of the plainclothes section that looked after the sea to sky corridor, they called it. So everywhere from Lions Bay up to and including Whistler and Pembroke. And there was a team of 7 or 8 of us at that time. And I was the sergeant in charge of that. So what happened on this particular case is the original call went into the Bowen Island detachment, which is part of our zone of helping out kind of thing. And it went to a corporal there by the name of Don Southern, and it came in as a report of missing it. So the call initially came into Squamish because Jodi was from Squamish and it came from her family. And then Squamish sent it over to Bowen Island, saying, can you check into this? They did some checking, and I don't know how much time elapsed, but it was 4 days from when she was last seen to when I got the call. And at that time, Bowen Island detachment was somewhat suspicious of it. They didn't think this was your normal missing, that something might have happened. And they asked that we come in and help them. And that's how I got started. So I think it was on the 24th. Jodi went missing on June 20th. And I think it was the 24th. She was last seen on the June 20th, I should say.
The smaller Bowen Island detachment was initially tasked with looking into Jodi's disappearance, but it became clear to them that this wasn't a normal missing person file. They very quickly passed this one back to the larger Squamish detachment to enlist the help of their plainclothes investigators. By the time the more specialized investigators arrived in Bowen, it was now Thursday, June 25th, and the team began to assemble the timeline, interview people, and pull CCTV footage. But despite their best efforts, the team was facing what Jenni refers to as an uphill battle.
The police in this case didn't get there until day 6. And that's not criticism of the police. Like, Don Sutherland got the call on the Wednesday and, like, the police were there on the Thursday. But that's 6 days. And see, when I look at all the things that could have happened, regardless of whether it's a massive elusive cover-up or it's not, 6 days is an uphill battle for the police. 6 days plus people not really wanting to speak to you is an uphill battle for the police.
Another hurdle the team faced was speaking with a group of mostly teens and young adults who didn't want to talk to the police or become involved in a police investigation. There were drugs at the party and people who dealt drugs on the island. You also had individuals who may have lied to their parents about even being at the party. The initial reluctance was frustrating, but some folks just took some coaxing.
Initially, early on, and I don't know where the story started, but we were it hit the press that the locals weren't cooperating. And I have no idea where that sort of idea originated. Now, there's always reluctant witnesses. There's always people that don't want to talk. We had a drug dealer that didn't want to talk, that was partying with this crew. But you'd sit down and assure them that we weren't interested in the drug part of it, and you would usually get over that, right?
Rumors have spread in the media that the people of Bowen Island were not helpful to the immediate investigation, but Peter does not believe that was true. He did, however, confirm with us that there were parents in other communities who were concerned about Bowen and that it was known as a party island for teenagers.
There is an element of the fact that Jodi wasn't from there that I think played into this a little bit. That she was an outsider coming in to party, and Bowen Island had a very big reputation at that time for being a party spot for teenagers. And I know that for a fact because I was living in West Vancouver at the time, and my daughter was going to high school there. And I can still remember getting parents telling us, "Don't let your kid go to Bowen Island." And what it was there was a party atmosphere. There was lots of drugs around, and the kids, once they got over there, didn't have to come back because the ferry stopped at 10 o'clock at night. So I can remember getting warnings about it. Now, since that time, of course, I've been to Bowen many times now, and I've talked to lots of people in Bowen. And there's a subset of people that are sort of the workers over there, the people that do the day-to-day, the logging, the building of homes, the cutting of trees. There's an inner core there, and then there's those that have come after the fact. And so to be a local there, I think the joke was you had to be there 20 years, 25 years, right? So there is that element, but I think that's common in most small towns. I think the island aspect gives it more of an isolated kind of aspect to it, which I think plays up to the drama a bit, but it is what it is, right? Everybody we tried to talk to initially talked to us, I think.
Within 2 days of the RCMP arriving on Bowen Island, Gavin was identified as a person of interest. On Saturday, June 27th, he was interviewed by investigators for 9 hours. Peter shared with us what he could about that initial interview.
He's given his version publicly. There's a couple of things I can't reveal because it was sensitive to the investigation at the time, and there's still sensitive information, and I can't reveal that kind of stuff. But nothing earth-shattering in that. But publicly, he basically says she wandered off to somebody else's place and named somebody else that he went to. The police looked into that other person at the time and sort of ruled them out. He says that she may have walked down. He sort of throws out the possibilities as to what she may have done. He says, well, she just walked down to the ferry. So he comes up with a couple of possibilities of where she may have gone, and that's sort of it. Sort of still claiming that he didn't see her again, and away we go.
Eventually, Gavin was released after being brought in for a 9-hour interview, and the investigation continued. We asked Peter if there were any significant findings early on.
Were there any key findings? I think the key finding was that there was no other findings. She went over with like a carry-on bag kind of thing, and wearing her clothes and whatever, and nothing was ever found of anything. So the searches that we did up and down the area where they were last seen walking were all, we recovered lots of items, but none of them were identified to Jodi. So I think the significant portion is the fact there was nothing else found, that she virtually seemed to have disappeared into thin air. So I think that was the most significant finding. Now, and people ask me about this, but the problem with not finding a person or a body is really detrimental to any kind of criminal homicide investigation. You go from what I always describe as having to deal with possibilities to having to deal with probability. And there's a big difference. because a body and a forensic and a crime scene of any kind obviously can point you in certain directions and lead you to certain suspicions and all kinds of things like that. Without a body, you're sort of going on balance of probability. So your job is to become, well, let's try to explore every possibility or probability, and then eliminate them one by one to see where we stand. But you can never, and the disadvantage in this case, you can never say it's impossible something didn't happen. I forgot to mention one thing. She didn't have her cell phone with her at the time, right? Her cell phone had been taken away by her mom because of some dispute she had with her over the phone. So, and that would go back to, problems we were up against. Sometimes the cell phones can lead to a lot of good evidence, right?
The RCMP, search and rescue teams, and locals conducted multiple searches for Jodi from late June into July. Helicopters, boats, dogs, and even dive teams looked for evidence that could tell them where Jodi was. On one search, dozens of locals walked shoulder to shoulder through the area that Jodi was last seen. They collected 8 garbage bags of materials, none of which could be tied to this case. The physical island itself began to create its own significant challenges.
Now, the other part of this was that it was on an island, of course. It's a heavily wooded island. I don't know if you've ever been to Bowen, but I assume you have. Most people think, well, how do you disappear on an island? Well, it's a very rugged island, and there's a lot of forested areas and trails, and it's big. It's a lot bigger than people think it is. So we explored things like, could she have got to the ferry? Could she have fallen off a cliff in her walk and landed in the ocean? Could somebody else have picked her up? Was she seen hitchhiking? That kind of thing is all the areas. And even in sort of reviewing all this with Jenni and the doc crew, it's the same problem. You have to still deal with probabilities. Can you say with absolute 100% assuredness that this didn't happen? No, you can't. And I think that's the real problem in any of those kinds of cases, right?
These search areas have been combed over many times over the years, unfortunately yielding no results. Notably, it has been reported that Gavin did not participate in the searches for Jodi. On July 2nd and 3rd, the province newspaper printed back-to-back articles on Jodi's case. In the first article, they interviewed Gavin, where he states, quote, "She is just a really smart girl, and I just hope she's found." The article reveals the fact that Gavin was on probation and was not supposed to be in contact with Jodi. In the article, he minimized the assault against Jodi and made Jodi out to be the aggressor. When asked about meeting with her while on probation, he said Jodi had tricked him into meeting her. Gavin said that he cried during his police interview, especially when the investigators accused him of being responsible for her disappearance. In what feels like an attempt to embolden the theory that she ran away, Gavin stated, quote, "She had been talking that night about me taking my dad's truck and running away with her. I don't know if she would actually carry that out or not." The article ends with Gavin saying, "I really hope she's found safe and everything. I wouldn't do anything to hurt Jodi again."
On July 3rd, the province printed another article. This one featured an interview with Gavin's mother, Lynn. In the interview, Lynn goes on the offensive and characterizes Jodi as a problem. Some of her statements are quite shocking when read in the context of a missing teenage girl. The article, written by Laura Stone, is titled, "Girlfriend Was Trouble, Mom Says." Lynn Fedoruk says she banned manipulative girl from her home. The article reads, "While the ground search for missing Squamish teen Jodi Henrickson was scaled back yesterday, the mother of her ex-boyfriend thinks she's simply run away." Quote, "That's something she would have done knowing her character," said Lynn Fedoruk, mother of Jodi's ex-boyfriend, Gavin Arnott. Quote, "She did run away last summer when she stayed with me for 3 months, Fedoruk told the province. She has been regularly staying out all night since she was 15 years old. She doesn't come home on a regular basis. She fights with her parents just like any 15-year-old girl. I'm not saying they are bad parents. It's just the way teen girls are." The article goes on. Fedoruk said that she banned Jodi, who she called a scheming and manipulative girl, from her home. Quote, "I really tried to like her. I just found that I couldn't do that. Fedoruk then said that Jodi was a bad influence on her son, who was an avid biker who won the Test of Metal cross-country mountain bike race 4 times before he met Jodi. Quote, "He stopped riding his bike and he started hanging out all night, and for the first time not calling me and telling me where he was," she said. "This girl has been trouble with a capital T." The article goes on to say, she said Jodi could have met the wrong person after her son walked away from her during a discussion on Bowen Island's Miller Road at 5:30 in the morning, the day she disappeared, but more likely that she took off, possibly to Alberta, Fedoruk said. The article then finishes with Lynn stating that she hopes Jodi is found, and then she adds she's probably hiding out somewhere because she's totally embarrassed by all the media attention. When asked for a response for the article, Jodi's family, the Henricksons, provided a written statement, and it reads as follows. "We have chosen not to comment on questions that only fuel already tense relationships. Throwing blows at Jodi's ex-boyfriend and his family is not going to bring Jodi home any faster. It just increases the already raw and heightened emotions that everyone that cares about Jodi is feeling at this time." That same evening that the article was released, the Henricksons held a rally at Horseshoe Bay to keep Jodi in people's minds. A large group of people showed up to support the Henrickson family. We are now going to take a quick break to hear from our sponsors.
Eventually, the Integrated Homicide Investigation Team took on Jodi's case. While she was still considered a missing person, there are certain criteria that a case can have which allows for IHIT to take on a suspicious missing persons case. On March 4th, 2010, IHIT announced that Jodi's case was now being investigated as a homicide. Now, this doesn't mean that IHIT has declared that she was in fact murdered, but rather that the case is being investigated as a homicide. The homicide scenarios fall into categories around how an individual may have been murdered. For example, if a gun was used, there would be shell casings and blood evidence. Nothing was found to support this idea along the route where Jodi was last seen. The same is true for bludgeoning or stabbing. There were no large pools of blood or spatter along the road or anywhere investigators looked. The same with the idea of a hit and run with a vehicle. No evidence was found of a crash. In the Neil Boyd article, Peter Cross speculated that the lack of evidence could indicate that Jodi was strangled. Quote, "If she'd been shot, knifed, beaten, or bludgeoned, we would have found traces of blood. With strangulation, there typically isn't any evidence left behind. But getting rid of a person's body isn't easy either."
In his interview given to Neil Boyd, Randy Arnott, Gavin's father, said that the RCMP told him that they believe that Gavin killed Jodi between 6:30 a.m. and 8:30 a.m. Gavin then went back to the house party to grab his truck shortly after 9. He then returned to where Jodi's body was. He then drove to a remote part of the island and disposed of her. Incidentally, there is a very remote part of the island just a short drive up from the rental home. Then, at 11 a.m., he went to the funeral service for George. To be clear, this is not the definite version of events. This is the RCMP's theory of what happened, which they explained to Randy, Gavin's father. Randy owns an excavation company, and this fact has also raised some concerns. Here is a paragraph from the Neil Boyd article. After the police informed him of their suspicions, Randy Arnott said that he went to check the condition of his excavators. Gavin knew how to operate them, and could have used one to bury Jodi deep in the ground. 2 of the excavators were in residential areas, and it would have been impossible to use them without detection. 3 others were at Randy's crushing pit in the Twin Islands rock quarry. There was simply no possibility of digging there. But 1 excavator was up in the woods. Gavin could have used it without being noticed. Randy went up to check and said that he was relieved to see that the machine had not been touched. Of the accusations levied at his son, Randy was quoted as saying, "I don't think he did it, but you also have to be realistic. It's not entirely out of the realm of possibility. You can never know for sure." After the announcement from IHIT in 2010 that this was now being investigated as a homicide, and the many revelations in Neil Boyd's article in 2011, the file with Jodi Henrickson's name on it went cold. While Gavin's behaviors in 2009 led many people to suspect him or think it was suspicious, the reality is that by the laws of our country, he remains uncharged and therefore innocent concerning this matter.
Peter was able to give us some insight into the chain of custody this file went through over the years.
Yeah, I think this file went from me, it went from Bowen Island Detachment to Squamish GI, which is what we were. The reason they wanted me to keep on doing the file was because I had IHIT experience, was one of the founding members of IHIT, so they had no problem with us doing the file because we know the protocols and stuff. So then it went to another IHIT team because I got transferred out about a year and a half after this file. I went back to Surrey actually. And so then it went back to a regular IHIT team. And then from the regular IHIT team, it went to an unsolved homicide team inside of IHIT, which I didn't know existed at the time, to tell you the truth. And then the people in charge of those teams change, right?
When a file goes cold and all leads are exhausted, it still remains open. However, the file will go through a yearly review to see if anything else can be looked into. Sometimes fresh eyes can be helpful to older cases.
Basically what happens in a police file like that, it reaches a point where there's no new information coming in or there's no new lead to follow up. So it's all put in a bit of a package. Here we are, but we're still stalemated. What happens in those cases with the RCMP is it goes in, now they'll always say it's active, as you know, they always say it's an active investigation, which sort of gives the hint to all the public that, they're actively working. Well, they're not actually working. It sits in a file. Usually the file in my day used to be reviewed at least every year. And you would go through and review it to see if there was any new information that had been put on file, or that you hadn't been notified of. And you'd go through it to see if there's anything new. If there wasn't, you'd write, still under investigation and diary data for a year down the road. And I think that's the process they're still doing. It might even be 2 years down the road when you review them. So it's in this sort of homeostasis kind of state. So the file just sits there. And I think that's literally what's been going on for 15 years.
So things remained cold. That was until Jenni and her production company started looking into Jodi's story as the premise for a documentary. Peter and Jenni assembled a long list of individuals that were close to this case. That included family members, friends, Bowen Island residents, law enforcement, searchers, and, of course, everyone who was at the party on that fateful night. Jenni shared with us some of the advantages and disadvantages that she encountered while speaking to witnesses about a 15-year-old case.
In some ways, this being a cold case has been helpful because I think people who were in an environment at the time where they might have been scared or they might have been caught or they might have been doing their own illegal stuff. And so they didn't want to talk to the police because, I'm selling coke off the side. So I'm not going to invite the police in and be like, oh, hey, I heard this weird thing. Because 15 years have passed, they're willing to speak to me. Their lives have changed. We've had so many people talk to us who had not spoken at that time, which has been amazing. And I'm so thankful to those people. The downside is these things that we find. These very specific questions we now know to ask people that wouldn't have been known at the time for the police to ask people. Big difference between, oh, did you see anything? And let me ask you this very specific question. And it's a yes or no. And you might not even understand how it relates to this bigger picture, but it's 15 years ago. So if I were to ask you a question about, did you see this specific thing on a Saturday 15 years ago? You'd be like, I don't know. It was 15 years ago.
Individuals who might have had useful information for law enforcement back in 2009 are now coming forward to speak with Jenni and Peter. Although they may have been hesitant to talk to the police 15 years ago, enough time has passed for them to recognize the importance of sharing what they know, and also to feel less fearful about coming forward.
I'd say there's even more on revisiting this thing 15 years later. because what's happened is these kids that were 17 or 18 or 19 at the time have grown up. 15 years have gone. They all have, most of them are married and have kids on their own. So whether that's prompted new remembrances of it or new speculations, that's what sort of the documentary has gone through, is some other stories of people that were involved. I can't go into too much of it because we are being fairly strategic. So I can't say too much more than that. But yeah, there were other people at the time, 15 years ago, there wasn't as many that came forward with that kind of information. Now there have been more, and which has set us down this investigative path.
Although the vast majority of witnesses have been helpful, there are still some holdouts. Jenni has found that the wives and girlfriends of the boys who were present at the party that night have been great assets in creating a cooperative mindset. But there are still a couple of people she is interested in talking to.
There's a few boys left that won't speak to me, and some of them I managed to crack by going through their girlfriends or wives. Like, I find that women care more, even if they're not from the island or where they are at the time. They'll kind of say to their partners, like, "No, you absolutely should be saying anything you know about this because, someone's daughter, someone's sister, it's a person." And it's funny that the women have been more responsive, but there's a few boys who are holding out, which if they hear this and they were at that house before the big party that night, I would love to speak to them because we're trying to confirm an allegation of something that happened that Friday.
During their investigations for the documentary, a common theme arose from that era. Older men and teenage boys with younger teenage girls, along with parties fueled by drugs, alcohol, and incidents of violence.
People have called me from Bowen or from Squamish and talked to me about their own violent situations. And it's painted a picture for me of what was normalized at that time. And I am talking specifically about Bowen Island because this is where I have been focused my attention, but I am sure this happens in other towns, other cities. But what was normal at the time was young girls dating older boys, substances being involved. There's not a huge police presence in that area, and those relationships being violent and controlling and toxic. And I have had girls who are now women phone me and say, at that time, I didn't realize how serious this was because I was also in it. So someone going missing because something shady happened was almost like a given at that time.
Because Jodi's body has never been found, the documentary team has worked its way through several theories in this case.
Well, we've had, I can talk about some of the theories we've had. We've had the theory that she met up with some nefarious characters on Bowen Island afterwards. We've had a theory that she had overdosed on drugs. We had a theory that she committed suicide. We've had theories that she drowned by falling off the ferry. Again, you're looking at probabilities and all this kind of stuff, right? We've had to go through all those. Did she end up in the water? Was she on land? If she ended up in the water, that posed a whole bunch of new problems because the way the flow of the water around Bowen Island, it's very unpredictable, the currents. So we talked to crab fishermen, for instance, who would tell you they put in their pots and they'd come back the next day and they'd be 2 miles in a different area, right? So the problem with the body and water is obviously, well, is a problem because of just disintegration of the body from fish life and all that kind of stuff. And then the currents, we searched the beaches and all that kind of stuff with helicopters and everything else. And she would normally turn up in that first 24, 48 hours. Of course, we weren't there in those first 48 hours, right? So that's the kind of thing that we've dealt with.
The first theory in this case is that Jodi simply ran away. This theory was started by Gavin in the province newspaper and repeated by his mother. The idea that a 17-year-old girl would go to a party and then run away to Calgary seems fairly unlikely. Keep in mind that she has not accessed any services, bank accounts, phone services, or anything in 15 years, and her social media is also dark. It really doesn't hold much water.
My belief is no. For the braces reason, but also this is a girl that really loved her family, that openly talks about loving her family. And by all accounts, she was like so buzzing about getting her braces off. She was really over having braces. And so like just like vanity reasons is one of the main things that rules out runaway for me. Like, why the frick would you run away right before you were supposed to get your braces off? For the braces reason, but also this is a girl that really loved her family, that openly talks about loving her family, that had loving parents. Like, a toxic relationship with a boyfriend that your parents don't approve of does not mean running away and not speaking to them for 15 years or contacting your best friends in the world ever again.
Another theory that we often hear in missing persons cases is that the person died from a toxic combination of drugs and alcohol or an overdose. Again, this theory that we hear all the time is fairly unlikely as well.
Well, did she overdose? Has she overdosed somewhere? From all the information we have been able to gather, she was not that kind of person. So did she voluntarily party too hard and something fatal happened? My belief is no. But that is a rumor that has been out there. My belief at this point is no.
So there is also the theory of a random kidnapping. In this theory, like something out of a movie, a random stranger finds Jodi on the side of the road within minutes of her having had an argument with her ex-boyfriend, and then that stranger abducts her and takes her to a secondary location, either on or off the island. Statistically, this is not really plausible. Most violent crimes in Canada are committed by a person that the individual actually knows.
Thirdly was, well, what if it was a randomer? Like a random person kind of threw her in the car and took her away right now? My belief is no. Based on what we know of who was on the island at the time, based on the ferry, CCTV footage, like my belief is no.
Now, a slightly more plausible theory is that Jodi was struck by a drunk driver or some kind of hit and run accident, which would be followed by some sort of cover up. People do drink and drive on the island, they drink and drive everywhere. And it was early on a Saturday morning with several parties going on the island the night before. Now, while this theory is possible, Jenni does not believe it to be the case.
That leaves us with, did something terrible happen as in drunk driving, which was very common on the island? My belief is no. I was very open to it at the beginning, but a cover-up involves so many people keeping their mouth shut that I just don't think this would be the most perfect cover-up in the world. So in some ways, I'm relieving Bowen Island of that reputation that some people theorized, well, if something had happened with the teens, they would have covered it up. The parents would have dealt with it in-house kind of thing. And I do not believe at this point that that happened, because I think that just would have involved too many people keeping their mouths shut. And it's like statistically doesn't work.
This leaves us with only foul play as the predominant theory. After their 4-year-long in-depth investigation for the documentary and weighing out all other theories, Jenni and Peter believe that Jodi was the victim of foul play. However, their lines of investigation have opened up to more than one possibility. They are hoping that the renewed interest in this case will provide them with the information they need to definitively say what happened to Jodi.
I believe she was the victim of foul play. I'm not saying from who, because I'm still looking at these two scenarios. And I believe that other people have been told bits and bobs from one of these two people over the past however many years. And that is why I now find myself on this like media parade, which I do not feel comfortable doing and don't want to be doing. And my job is on the other side of the camera. My job is not on this side of the camera. But so many people that I have approached have told me what I needed to know. And now I need the people who I don't know who they are. I don't know their names to approach them. I need them to hear about this. I need them to put two and two together, and I need them to phone me. And that is why I'm doing these interviews, because I need people, I believe people have heard and just didn't know to connect the dots to Jodi Henrickson's name, because Jodi Henrickson's name has not been mentioned enough in the last decade.
Through the course of Jenni and Peter's investigation, a second person of interest came to the surface. We believe this person can be tied to this case in two potential theories. The first is that they acted alone and are somehow responsible for Jodi's disappearance. By themselves, just them. If this is a fact, then the focus on Gavin over the years has been wrong. The second theory, though, with this person involves a type of cover-up. In this theory, there were at least two suspects who were involved in Jodi's disappearance, including this new second person of interest. While for so many years the focus has been on a single person, this new theory opens up the world of a conspiracy to cover up an unnatural death. This theory is still actively being investigated, so Jenni only spoke in vague terms about how this theory may have played out.
This person's name was first raised to me when I was speaking to a source, and I said, if it was me and something had happened, an accident had happened, let's say, and somebody had ended up dead, I'm talking about like drunk driving. I'm talking about I'm not necessarily talking about a violent action. Like, just let's say an accident happened. I would call my dad. If I'm standing looking literally at someone who's passed away and I'm on my own with them and whatever, I would call my dad, overdose, whatever. And this person said, oh no, he wouldn't have called his dad. He would have called X. And that was the first time I heard the name. And then I was like, how do I know that name? And I'm looking at my notes. And then he used to live with someone that was connected with the case. And it all just starts. And then more and more people start saying the same name. And I was like, this is so crazy to me that this person was never connected to this case back then. But I've heard it over 20 times at this point, and I'm unable to rule it out yet. Which just is why when people say to me, oh, you're on a witch hunt and it's the court of public opinion and blah, blah, blah. I'm like, no, I'm genuinely not, because I couldn't look you in the eye right now and tell you 100% that this other person didn't do it or wasn't involved in it.
In everything we have ever read about Jodi's case, this was the first time we had heard about this second suspect. For Jenni, looking into this man's past has been eye-opening. On one hand, the men who knew him had good memories, but for the women who knew him, it was a different story.
But this person, if you ask any man on Bowen about this person, oh, he was a good guy, oh, this, oh, that, oh, blah, blah, blah. Ask any woman, he beat the shit out of me. He held a gun to my head. He was violent with me. And it's like, how can the same person be so well-liked and so respected, but also so horrible and violent and dangerous towards women?
Now, Jenni didn't reveal this man's name, but he was well known on Bowen at the time. He was a man with a criminal mindset who enjoyed partying with the younger crowd despite being older than they were.
So when we made the decision to go public and start going to Bowen more and speaking to people, and the need for keeping it low key was gone, a name, the same name, kept coming up. And it is my understanding that that name was never brought up to the police at that time. So for me, I was like, well, why wasn't the name brought up to the police at that time? And so I start digging into this person, and I look up their criminal record, and it's drugs, guns, assault, drugs, guns, assault. How much can I say? Let's say this person drove a motorbike, and was a drinker, and was in this world partying with, Bowen's a small place, and from what I can gather, parties would have the young people, the middle-aged people, and the old people. These three groups that often would intermingle in a way that perhaps other societies wouldn't, I guess, or other social circles wouldn't. And so this person was loosely connected to the teens who were partying on the island at the time.
Unfortunately, whatever this man may have known has left this world with him. Jenni followed this lead as far as she could, literally.
Well, he's dead. I was trying to find him for ages, and then managed to get through to Kamloops PD who confirmed he was dead, they wouldn't send me his death certificate, which I thought was a bit strange.
So the documentary team has narrowed it down to 2 theoretical persons of interest who may have more knowledge in Jodi's disappearance. The last person known to see her, who is Gavin, this is public knowledge, and then this second person who is now unfortunately deceased. At this time, due to the fact that this is obviously an open and ongoing investigation, Jenni did not feel comfortable sharing on our platform what her leading theory is on this case after the extensive work that her and so many others have done behind the scenes.
When I talk about the documentary now coming second, see, if I was a good documentary producer, I would make a documentary with what I think happened based on me ruling out everything else. I could make a documentary that legally would be allowed to leave audience knowing what we think happened. And this is where I'm telling you I'm bad at my job, because that's not enough for me right now. I have more than enough to make a documentary that is fascinating, that has twists and turns, that leave the audience knowing very clearly our perspective on what happened here. But I don't want to share that information, because if this becomes real, then me sharing that information for entertainment's sake will disvalidate a court case.
We asked Peter what his theory was, and he gave us the best retired RCMP answer that he could muster.
Well, I'm going to leave my view. It hasn't changed much, but I'll leave my view out there because there's nothing affirmed yet. So what I think happened really is not even relevant, isn't it, in some ways, right? So we can all speculate. Yeah, hopefully we'll solve this mystery somewhere where we can speak up a bit, right? I still got it, eh?
With the documentary nearing completion, their focus has turned to Alberta, of all places. Many of the young 2009 Bowen Island teens are now adults living in Alberta. There is a hope that this podcast episode may reach people who still need to speak to Jenni and to Peter.
Well, I think there's a general theory out there that somebody may have known or seen something that at the time didn't seem relevant to them, but now 15 years later, on second thought, and in a different position in life, well, geez, it's sort of reawakening that sort of perception of it. And we've had people come forward saying, I didn't think of it at the time, but now that I'm hearing this or reading this, that it's twigged something. So I think we've had a lot of people, of course, move off Bowen, especially the younger crew that were around at that time. They've moved to places like Alberta. A lot of them are working in the oil fields, for instance. Gavin himself is up in the oil field somewhere. That kind of thing is we're interested in people that might have moved away. And like I say, most of the people we know have moved to Alberta. So we've sort of said the trend is maybe somebody there that has a connection to Bowen, knows something or heard something, or something was said to them that they didn't really put much notice of at the time. And now it seems maybe it was relevant. That's the idea of the publicity, I think.
Jenni hopes that by interviewing the holdouts, including Gavin Arnott, she can come to the end of her investigation and definitively say what happened to Jodi. This includes the possibility of publicly clearing Gavin in this case.
If this ends up being another violent relationship that went too far, and I say if, and Jodi becoming another number in this gross tower of violence against women, is like, it's almost like I don't want that for her. And I know that sounds so stupid. Like, I know it sounds stupid for me to say, I would rather there's another ending to this for her, because I don't want her to become another statistic in this like massive which is like violent relationships often end in a fatality. And so see, honestly, when I speak to people who are part of the boyfriend's world, and I do hope to speak to the boyfriend in the near future, it's almost like I want to say to him, I want this not to be you. Like, I really want this not to be you. And see, if I find out it wasn't you and this clears your name, then like, awesome. Because I want this not to be you. For her. because then also people can stop blaming her for, "Oh, she went back, she went to that party, she went to whatever, like, she stayed in the relationship." Like, if it's not him, it, like, clears her. But even saying that, like, there is no happy ending for her. There's no happy ending for her, so none of it matters. None of it matters. But all I want so I've become such a bad producer with this, because like, I almost am at the point where I don't need to know what happened. That's not my job. It's not my job to put someone in jail here. It's not my job to get enough evidence so that the police can charge, and again, we still have two people that we're looking at. Um, I just want to find her, because I feel like for her family, it doesn't matter at this point, and I'm not speaking on behalf of them, I'm just telling you how I feel. What actually happened doesn't change where we're all at. But what could change where we're all at is her mom being able to go to bed at night, at least knowing where her daughter is.
Early on in this investigation, the media reported that the good people of Bowen Island had closed ranks and were not cooperative with the investigation. There was a theory that Jodi was an outsider and not one of them, but Jenni has found that that is not the case.
I've learned that I was naive when I first started this, and that I thought that Bowen Island closed ranks because she wasn't an islander, and I thought that they didn't care, and I think I was, like, younger and pre-kids and slightly more inexperienced and might have rubbed some people up the wrong way, and what I have learned now is that a lot of people really did care, but people were scared or employed and didn't wanna lose their jobs by speaking about something, and I think that I half owe Bowen Island an apology for my perception at the beginning of this, but I also half want to give some of them a boot up the arse, because if you're at a party that Friday and I think you might have something really, really important to me, and I want to ask you about it, then pick up my phone call. That's how I think. It's half an apology and half a boot up the arse.
We asked Jenni if she could help us understand the impact that Jodi's disappearance has had on Jodi's family and her loved ones.
I don't think I can describe the impact this has had on her family, because they're in a living nightmare. They're in a living nightmare. And these are nice, normal people with jobs and dreams and relationships, who not only have to deal with not seeing someone they love every day, but have to deal with not knowing where they are or what happened to them, but also have to deal with society and the world moving on, when for them, the world didn't move on. The world doesn't move on. Can you imagine dealing with that when it's your sister? Like, no. Like, the fury they must have at the world around them, and it makes my skin crawl off my body when they say thank you to me, or when her friends text me thank you, or her mom says thank you. I'm like, don't say thank you to me, because 1, this started out as a business for me, right? Like, documentaries, we can all say they're altruistic, and they are, and sometimes, but I'm in TV production. That is my job. So don't say thank you to me. But also, it feels like the least it feels like the least that we as humans can do is to care about this, and care about Jodi as a person, and that person's life being taken from them. And not even just taking from them, the disrespect of not having her family be able to go and sit somewhere and have somewhere to grieve. Like, the disrespect that's been shown to her family. Like, that mom should have somewhere to go. That's what I think. I just think they deserve to be treated like humans. Sorry. Usually it's Pete I'm crying to. It's not you. Like, it's a lot because I'm choosing to involve myself in this, but they didn't choose. They didn't choose this for themselves, but they have to live with it every day. And it's like they're one of how many?
We know that this case has been cold for some time, but there has been a big momentum swing in recent years and months. As all of us know, cases much colder than this have been solved. we know that there are people out there who have information. We asked Jenni how our listeners could help.
They can share your podcast, share her story. You can follow us on Instagram at Finding Jodi H. There's nothing interesting in there except her contact information, but it was just the easiest way to get her contact information out there, because the best case scenario for me is that people who I think are in Alberta, I don't think they're even from Bowen or Squamish, but that people in Alberta have heard bits and bobs of a story and just didn't know to connect it to this case. And the best case scenario for me and why that we're on this tour is that someone sees this podcast or a link that's been shared to Neil Boyd's article or whoever and is like, ooh, actually someone did tell me something 7 years ago or 8 years ago, but I just didn't know that this girl was missing. And like, you are sitting on such important information. And I just need to get the word out there so that you know I need to speak to you.
If you have information on this case, there are several ways you can contact the team. Tips can be sent to findingjodi, that's JODI, at gmail.com. They can be phoned into 236-712-3349 or sent anonymously via the Google form linked on their Instagram at findingjodih. That's FINDINGJODIH.
As for Gavin Arnott, he is now married and a father living in Alberta. However, he has had some legal issues. In 2011, so 2 years after Jodi's disappearance, Gavin was charged with sexual interference and possession of child pornography for allegedly keeping illicit photographs of a 14-year-old girl on a cell phone and computer. Gavin was living in Black Creek on Vancouver Island at the time of these offenses. He was later arrested for breaching conditions in connection with that case when he threatened the 14-year-old victim whom he was in a sexual relationship with. Gavin would have been in his early 20s at this time. Gavin was convicted of interference and 2 breaches of an undertaking. The child pornography charges were withdrawn by the prosecution.
We asked Jenni what the future of the docuseries is. When can we and our audience expect to see it released? Throughout our conversation, she insisted that she was the worst TV producer ever, as the documentary is now coming second to her main goal, which is to find Jodi Henrickson.
There's nothing to plug because right now, for my own conscience and my own ethics and my own everything, my focus is on finding her. I drag Pete into that, even though he's constantly like, you should be filming more or doing this or whatever, or prioritizing strategy around the documentary. And I'm like, no, because my priority is finding her. I pay for cameras to come and follow us finding her. And so that's why, even though this used to be called The Island, now I call it Finding Jodi, because I just need that to be in everyone's head. This documentary will tell the story of how we found Jodi. And I have to keep that at the forefront of my brain. So there's nothing to plug, because until I find her, I'm not happy with the ending here.
Jodi Henrickson was last seen on Bowen Island in the early morning hours of June 20th, 2009. She was wearing jeans, a black long-sleeve shirt, and a black leather jacket. She is a white girl with long brown hair and brown eyes. She has a very small build, standing at just 5'3". If you have any information about her disappearance, you can submit your tips to findingjodi@gmail.com, that's JODI. You can fill out a Google Doc by going to the Instagram at findingjodih, that's JODIH, or you can call 236-712-3349. All tipsters can remain anonymous. If you have information you would like to give to the police, you can call IHIT at 1-877-551-4448. Or you can call Crime Stoppers at 1-800-222-8477. We want to thank you for joining us for this 2-part series on the disappearance of Jodi Henrickson. We would also like to thank Jenni and Peter for sitting down with us to tell us this important story. Our hearts go out to Jodi's family and community. We hope that some answers will come soon. If you or someone you love is seeking help for intimate partner violence, we encourage you to look up services in your area or call 211 to connect with resources that may help. We will see you soon with a new episode. So until then, stay safe, everyone.
Stay safe.